So this is the last day before we prorogue Parliament and hear the Queen's speech on May the 10th. The Queen will be, or whoever is speaking, will be reading out the government's legislative plans for the next year. The last time I spoke, I mentioned that we were rushing bills through in order to get to this point, and that on the timetable, the whips had put down that we might be back in Tuesday and Wednesday next week. That seems to have frightened the opposition benches because everybody wants to go out campaigning for the local elections. So in some ways, this week has been a story of opposition collapse to bills that they've been fighting all the way through, but then did compromise deals on. So that's been interesting. So a couple of the stories from that point of view, the Borders Bill and the Nationality Bill. You may have seen a speech I did where I lost my temper, not because I'm a great enthusiast for the government's Rwanda scheme, but in the general discussion about the Borders and Nationality Bill, we did have to endure yet once more endless speeches that only discussed the plight of refugees, refused to acknowledge there was any issue at all about border control, and effectively talked about the Priti Patel schemes as though they were kind of designed by, Nazis wanting to exterminate people. And so I just felt the double standards there were worth calling out, in particular because the idea of outsourcing your migration problem to African countries has been a tried and trusted method by none other than the EU. But I did quite enjoy setting it up by doing my speech denouncing the outsourcing to poor African countries and the exploitation, and I got hears from the Lib Dems and the Labour. Then when I announced that's why I'd opposed the EU, they all got very annoyed, but it was good fun. But anyway, as it happens, in the votes, that motion got passed, that amendment went through, and there was only a few amendments that actually they succeeded in thwarting the government on, one of which was this obsessive attachment to the 1953 Refugee Convention. There's two things to say about that. It's an amendment that Shami Chakrabarti has been pushing from the Labour benches, backed by all the law lords. And so it's got this kind of weighty international law must be respected at all costs. And I think it shows something about the mistakes that the Conservatives have made, because they actually should have used this Nationalities Bill to say we don't care about the 1953 Refugee Convention, not because we don't care about refugees, but because it's outdated, and we are not, just because we're signed up to this international treaty, we should design and develop our own attitude to refugees and to asylum seekers, appropriate for the modern world, appropriate for a sovereign state, and not be beholden to rules and regulations. But instead they keep saying this does fit in with the 1953 convention, and then Shami Chakrabarti says no it doesn't, and there's a row about the law, which is boring. Yesterday what happened was that Shami Chakrabarti rehearsed yet once more that this was one amendment that, despite the Commons having looked at it 5 times and saying no, we still don't want your amendment in, she then went to take it to a vote, and the Labour front bench said no vote. That was a split in the Labour Party, great aggravation on all sides. It actually did go to a vote, somebody else forced it to a vote. Labour were in split, didn't know what they were doing, and the government won it. And so intense upset in Labour ranks, which to a certain extent I quite enjoyed. But the dilemma always at this point in the legislative period, and I understand this, is that you end up in a situation where you've got to say this is an unelected House of Lords. The Commons have considered the Lords' amendments 4 times or 5 times or 3 times, and they keep voting to support the government and sending them back. And you can't just keep going, we're not taking any notice. They did do that around Brexit a lot. But at some point you just got to give way, so you just abstain, don't vote. That's what I've done on the dilemmas. The only thing that I continued to vote against, really just on principle, was the motions on the right to protest, because I just felt I'm voting against the restrictions on the right to protest no matter what. But as it happens, they didn't win that vote, and it seems that the Conservative whipping operation is far stronger than the opposition's disquiet on these questions. And in the end, a lot of Labour MPs certainly were abstaining, just not present, because they want to go home, basically. The Lib Dems to be fair, but against the spirit of democracy, diligently stay there till the bitter end voting against the government. But, you know, you have to give way at some point. Another example, though, of the government losing their nerve, and when I say losing their nerve, where they should have got rid of the 1953 Refugee Council commitment, also is in the elections bill, where basically they did a fudge on the Electoral Commission. Instead of basically just scrapping the Electoral Commission, which is, after all, people treat it as though it's like a, you know, God-given, been there forever guarantee of democracy. It was actually introduced by Tony Blair. It's an NGO, you know, and the government's attempts at clipping its wings because of the way the Electoral Commission dealt with Brexit effectively and showed their bias. And I think the Conservatives were committed to teaching them a lesson, but therefore they have intervened in the Electoral Commission's autonomy. What they should have done was just scrapped it, but they didn't do that. So you end up having a technical row with the Tories saying, no, we're not anti the Electoral Commission, we're just sorting it, and then the opposition saying that you hate the Electoral Commission. Everyone should just be more honest, in my view. Anyway, that dragged on and on and on, but even yesterday, even that, the Conservatives won the vote. So that's the end of it now, we're finished. I think there might be one amendment on a healthcare bill today, but prorogation will happen, and there's a ceremony, and people are sort of marginally, you know, lots of people wear robes and all that sort of thing. I'm not going to go to the Queen's speech, for your information, because I thought I couldn't cope with wearing the ermine again, and in the end, it's a nice show, but I don't really go along with the whole procedures of the House of Lords, and I don't want to kind of, you know, get into it in that way. So I know that Kate Hoey and Daniel Moylan, two of my friends, are both going. They're quite excited, but I'll watch on the telly. I wanted to just finish on, I spoke on a white paper debate yesterday on gambling, and there was a number of things to say to finish off this parliamentary part of the time here. This is a small debate, but it's about forthcoming legislation on gambling regulation. And there was, I don't know, 15, 16 speakers. Only 2 of us were critical, i.e. defending the rights of people to gamble without government moral panic. Everybody else, it was like being in a Puritan gathering. I mean, it was ridiculous. And all of it was premised on the basis that you couldn't trust ordinary people to make decisions about their own money. Problem gambling is a horrible thing, right? You know anyone who's kind of like addicted to it, or whether it's addiction, but somebody who's spent the family mortgage money or whatever. There's people in prison for embezzlement for doing that. It's a tiny, small number of people. Most people gamble because they enjoy it, and they even enjoy hoping they'll make money. And, you know, it's like the lottery, people spending £10 a week. You might think that's mad, but they want to improve their lives, and what's wrong with it? And then other people do it for skill and for a bit of excitement. Anyway, the point is, it's up to them why they do it. But oh no, not according to this lot. But the reason I'm saying it was because the paternalism in the room reminded me of what the House of Lords is like, which is their attitude to poor people and ordinary people is that they need to be protected from themselves. They need to be protected from all these bad things. And we in the House of Lords are going to look after them by bringing in lots of laws to protect them. And there's something about it that made me think this really is the great and the good here. But another example of where you realise what kind of place am I in, the person who spoke before me was Viscount Astor, who I've never seen before. He, in his declaration of interest, announced that he did have a bit of an interest in horse racing because he owns a race course. Not a race horse, a race course. And I thought, God almighty. And so I followed him, and you might have wondered why I declared that in my declarations that I didn't own a race course. That was because I was referring to Viscount Astor. And then when I mentioned it to my partner, he said, well, that's because the Astors, that's the Astors, Claire, you know, the famous, and I'm like thinking, oh yeah, you see, you're in this place with these kind of people that you think, oh, you'll be delighted to know that, by the way, despite the fact that he said that there should be lots of limitations on gambling apart from horse racing, which should be exempt from any possible, because racehorse is different, you understand, a degree of snobbishness you could not make up, and a degree. He did come up to me afterwards and say, very well said, I'm with you. And in fact, a few people who were listening came up and said, very well said, I'm with you. But the nicest bit was two members of staff who were just there staffing the thing, who said, "Oh, thank God you were here." One of them said, "I do like a flutter." And the other one said, "As a punter, you spoke on behalf of millions." So my message at the end of this parliamentary term is that I've probably got a lot more in common with the staff than I have with the Lord Asters of this world, or the Viscount Astor, to get his name right. But also, there's a kind of puritanism, paternalistic puritanism here, saving refugees, saving all, poor people, going around saving everybody, which I actually think is the real heart of anti-democracy. It's not just that we're not elected. There's an anti-democratic atmosphere in this place, which I'm glad to have a week off because of prorogation.